All right. Well, we are 1 minute over. So, welcome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this next session of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Amy Peltier. I am the Coalition and Advocacy Director here at the partnership. I am joined by my colleague Alicia Gardner. And we're happy to be with you today and presenting this session an analysis of no-fault evictions. I want to thank our sponsor for the session, Hartford Healthcare, and all of the other sponsors that have made this conference possible and for us to continue to allow it to happen virtually. We're so grateful. I would like now to turn it over to our presenters. First, I'm going to hand it off to Carter Shannon from Data Haven.
So my name is Carter Shannon. I'm with Data Haven. I'm going to introduce my colleagues in just a second, and we will be talking about no-fault evictions. We've done a little bit of an analysis, and we'll talk about the sort of policy landscape as well. You go to the next slide. So I am here with my colleagues, Andrew Carr. He is a social scientist and a data scientist with a PhD in sociology from Duke. He is a analyst at Data Haven. He's done most of the quantitative work on this project, as well as Darren Preslow, a former coworker of mine at the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center. He's a supervising attorney and he works with veterans statewide on a variety of civil legal issues, especially in housing. And then I'm, as I said, Carter Shannon. I have a master's in public health with a focus on health policy, specifically housing and homelessness. So just to give you a little preview of what this session will look like, first, we're going to lay the foundation of the background of the policies in Connecticut, recent changes to the landscapes, and the impact of evictions. We think this is really important, especially I know there's a lot of different expertises in the room. We want to make sure that there's sort of a shared vocabulary that we're using when we're talking about this, because sometimes different things get lumped under an eviction when it might be just a filing or a forced move. We'll then talk about the research we've done, the methods we use to process the data that we have, and what it means. And then looking ahead at action steps for future analysis that we would like to do. We would love to share our contact information with you to hear how you think you would be able to use this data and have some conversations around that. And then we would just ask that folks hold their questions until the end. We'll have a slide. Unless there's something that's like very unclear, then feel free to maybe pop it in the chat and we can clarify in real time. Next slide. So this will be our section on policy and the background, and I am going to pass it over to Darren.
Thanks, Carter. Good afternoon. So we thought it'd be helpful today to give a little bit of feedback on what the vernacular is when we talk about eviction versus sort of the legal understanding as we set up to a pretty specific analysis of one type of eviction to kind of give you some background. So there's a number of ways to terminate a tenancy, which is what technically some would say an eviction is. One is called a mutual rescission, which is where both the landlord and tenant agree, whether it's verbally or in writing, based on how they created their lease, to end their relationship, and they go their separate ways. The least favorite of the three is something called self-help, which both public policy and the courts highly frown upon, where one party or the other take it into their own hands to unilaterally change the relationship, whether that's a lockout, whether it's something else in between, whether it is non-payment of rent due to condition issues by a tenant, whatever that self-help is, and that could lead to the court process, which is attorneys call summary process, which is sort of the vernacular comparison to an eviction. And in its legal terms, right, it's pretty much about, in Connecticut, getting possession back by the property owner from whomever has possession. Next slide, please. So what is summary process, right? It is a statutory controlled process that deals in a court of equity. And what that means is that it's not just about what the statutes say, but the court actually has some ability to weigh the equities in that case when determining what's going to happen. And historically, that goes back to the ideas of property law and being a court of equity versus a court of law. But knowing that in mind, that is part of what's baked into that process. But the statutes are very specific about what the process looks like, and that's what drives the process. But keeping that in mind, there's a lot that goes on both before and after when you're in court. And I thought that would help give some background to understand this as well. Next slide, please. So this is what I often use when I'm talking to other clinicians or to sometimes clients, or I do trainings to other attorneys on summary process. It's sort of just giving a flow of the process. We call it summary process because it's exactly that. It is a really quick process. No one ever usually uses the word civil litigation and quick in the same sentence. So summary process in and of itself is an aberration under the law and is written as such because it moves so quickly for a variety of reasons. But when you look at, you see the summons and complaint, that is like day one when it gets to court. But prior to that, you can do a lot of other things. So normally, and it's required before you can go to court with a summons complaint, there needs to be some pre-notice. And depending on the cause of action, different things could happen. In a non-payment case, there is no requirement for that to happen. If it is a lease violation or a nuisance case, that, on the other hand, will require what's a CAPA notice, letting the tenant know that there's a problem or what they can do to fix it. Lapse of time cases, which are usually the lease has expired, is other than the notice to quit. So depending on the kind of housing and the kind of case, that window can be a month or two between when you get your first notice and before that case can go to court. We talked about self-help, or I did negatively in the beginning, but in some cases, tenants will just decide to leave once this notice process has begun and not wait to the formal court process. What we're talking about when I'm done is actually cases that are in court and utilizing the court summary process. Then there's the summons and complaint, which is required in any civil action, and it gives a date when it has to be back to court, which is the return date. And the complaint has all the details about what's going on in the case. The notice to quit has to have some specificity, a sentence, non-payment of rent. If it's a lease violation, case law has sort of required that there needs to be more specificity, but there is some general information, and depending on who is doing the eviction, it can be, I've seen 7-page notice to quits, and I've seen the 1-page court form, and it could be anywhere in between. The other thing to sort of keep in mind is that if this process is actively used by both sides, which that means the landlord files into court and a defendant enters the process, it can take weeks for this process to sort itself out. But back to what I said earlier about summary process, weeks, right? It can take weeks, maybe a month or two for this case to work through the court process. There are always exceptions, right? If someone never shows up in default, they can be out of court within 21 days with an execution. If they get involved, there's a trial, the decision needs to be written, that might go on for 6 months. But it's much more common to see a default entered than is to see someone go all the way to trial and a judge using the full 4 months to write a decision. The rest of this chart kind of shows sort of the flow and the process. And this is true for any kind of case. This is summary process forever. So whether it is for a non-payment case, a lapse case, and as we discussed, what is a no-fault eviction or a just cause kind of consideration in evictions, but also lease violations, nuisance, serious nuisance, never had the right, the full gamut. Next slide, please. So what is a no-fault eviction? It should be, or maybe it is, nowhere in the statutes do they use the term no-fault eviction, right? What the statute does describe, and I'm not going to read 47A23C to you, but what that statute does is it explains that certain tenants are protected from eviction except if there's good cause. And it's sort of this good cause that advocates in Connecticut have taken to expanding when we say we want just cause evictions. Another reminder is that housing law is a state law issue most of the time, not a federal court issue. So what you hear happening in Massachusetts or New York or Rhode Island really does not have any impact on what happens in state court in Connecticut. The exception to that rule is if you're in subsidized housing with a federal subsidy, HUD regulations will sometimes apply, and there's some federal requirements that can take, if not met, can take away jurisdiction or the power of a housing court to hear a case. But generally speaking, the flow, the process is state law. It is state statute driven. So when we think about this good cause and what this means, we need to think about what the statute says. And under the statute, if someone has good cause protection, and that is someone over the age of 62 or disabled and living in the building with 5 or more contiguous units, you get these good cause protections. 3-family home is excluded. LLCs owning a bunch of properties, same person, all in the same sort of row, that is technically excluded the way the law is written. And some of this has been kind of worked out in case law. So cases, that is sort of where it is. So even with good cause, and the statute explains, even if you are protected from good cause, there are exceptions which violate good cause. Non-payment, taking the house off the market, and some of the things, a piece of that. But those are usually things that you would use to rebut the protection, not the cause of action for the eviction. Next slide, please. So I want to give a little more idea of sort of where I fit into this, the work that I do. I work for the Connecticut Federal Legal Center, and we're what's called I put up here this sort of number one slide we use when we talk about what that means. And a medical legal partnership is a collaboration between attorneys, medical professionals, right? In my case, it may be social workers, it may be psychiatrists, maybe a nurse, anyone who is working with our veterans and the veteran themselves. And the idea being that in this medical legal partnership, early intervention and collaboration between the people working with my client lead to better outcomes. Oftentimes, the classic MLP story involves a child being brought to their doctor who is dealing with asthma. It turns out that the doctor can give an inhaler, treat the asthma, but the asthma is actually caused by black mold in the apartment. So the doctor, with all the best intentions, cannot remedy the black mold issue. So they would refer the case to their legal partner, in often cases the local legal services organization, that will then help that family advocate for conditions to be remedied. The idea being that where you see the problem is not often where it needs to be addressed, and working collaboration to do that. So in my work, although I'm often representing, and my colleagues are representing people in evictions, we're also seeing a lot of the before and a lot of the after, right? I'll have a clinician come ask me about, they're doing this weird thing. Is that something they can do, right? What consequences if we're unable to fix X, Y, or Z in these sorts of situations? So I see it often way before an eviction happens, and on the way as they're going out the door, as they're moving somewhere else, what that looks like. And that also involves, because we do more than just summary process, we do conditions cases, we do non-renewal, all sorts of different issues that our clients may be coming in with. But when you see the impact of an eviction, and as we'll talk about right to counsel in the next slide, but as we've seen a larger swath of veterans that we work with, it's important to understand that evictions have a very negative impact on the people that go through them. Obviously, it affects the landlord and it affects the tenant. But when we talk about a family being evicted, Carter can give you the research to back that up from a social science standpoint, but it takes about 2 years for the family to recover from that eviction process. But so when I'm giving some color to sort of where the law fits in and how it all sort of comes together, it's with my being embedded within this medical system that I look at a lot of these issues and think about how can we best resolve them? Where do we need to be looking for advocacy? And who is most at risk in some of these processes? Um, Next slide, please. I think it's important to sort of think about where we are today and how things have changed. I don't think here that COVID-19 has changed the landscape when it comes to housing and evictions in Connecticut. I think it's hard pressed. We're on a remote conference, right? I think the world has changed in the way it looks at things since COVID-19. And it's important to understand that it has definitely impacted housing. And this is anecdotal. You'll get data for other stuff later, right? But traditionally, the easiest way to evict a tenant, based on sort of the complexity of the case and the way the law sits, is non-payment. And what happened during the pandemic is that non-payment evictions were taken off the table for a period of time due to the situation surrounding the pandemic. It also reopened the state and funding to the ideas of rental assistance, which for the decade prior to the pandemic was almost non-existent. For my population of veterans, we sort of have different funding models and different things going on, so we are an anomaly in that sense. But the average family dealing with an eviction did not have anywhere to go to get some financial assistance when it came to non-payment. Maybe a security deposit if they were lucky. And even the last 5 years before the pandemic, that was almost non-existent. The pandemic changed dynamics in demand as well as cost, right? We've had inflation going on. Property values have gone up dramatically. Therefore, rental costs have gone up dramatically. Maybe not necessarily a change in housing stock. In many cases, a lot of the building has been more on the higher end of affordability, not what we need for moderate income situations. And that higher end income situations are not actually affordable to people with subsidies, like in my line of work, a HUD bash voucher or some sort of piece with that. But either way, there have also been some major statutory changes, right? The state passed right to counsel, which had been elsewhere in the country, mostly on a city basis, which has had more advocates in court. There was always a cause of action for unfair increases in rent, but they went in Superior Court. There was a few towns with fair rent commissions, but now state law is required 25, and I think the current law that just passed last week has now put it to 15,000 towns and communities now have to have a fair rent commission. And the other piece of this is the tenant union organization has come into play as well. We are seeing a growth of tenant unionization in Connecticut and two very big campaigns that started in the pandemic, one being Cap the Rent and the other being Just Cause, which is sort of speaking about what we're today, which is this no cause eviction kind of case. So we sort of keep all of this together. The world we're in now is very different than the one prior to the pandemic, and the calculus has changed, right? It's no longer necessarily easiest to evict someone for non-payment. Other areas are sometimes easier, right? Sometimes it's a no-fault eviction because you don't have to get into the details of why you're not keeping the relationship. That's why we have no-fault divorce, right? No-fault divorce allows people to get divorced without having to explain why they no longer want to stay in their marriage, rather than have the cause of action. So it is sort of the same piece. But with that comes considerations of policy, how we're organizing things, and the rental market is still a capitalist and sort of financial transaction, right? Connecticut is not a right to housing state. It's not even a right to shelter state. We're in a very sort of different situation than some of our neighbors to the east and west when it comes to looking at housing and how we meet the needs of housing. The other last piece for the VA, and also sort of coloring my opinions, is the VA takes what's called a housing first model. So when the VA works with its clients and its veterans, even if they are having disability challenges, mental health challenges, the baseline assumption when it comes to VA, right, Veterans Administration, is that you house someone first, then you are better able to work with all of the other complications. But if they're not housed, many of those things are not possible.
So thank you, Darren, for providing the sort of landscape and laying down all the different ways that these terms are used. Just to harken back a little bit to the impact of eviction, I want to emphasize that evictions impact like the household and the family and also the communities. Communities that have high levels of eviction have sort of lower social ties between neighbors, and especially folks that are low income can struggle when losing out on sort of the underpaid and unpaid labor that we talk about with neighbors. For example, if you have someone that watches your kids when you're at work, like an eviction of that family also implicates the other family. This research sort of came out of some conversations and watching the Just Cause advocacy that's been happening over the last couple years. Next slide. So the research question that we're working from is how do no-fault evictions intersect with other vectors of vulnerability among tenants? And when I say vectors of vulnerability, I mean any community or group that has been marginalized by the law or interpersonal discrimination, for example. So LGBTQ people, BIPOC people, people with criminal records, anyone that has been sort of has a more difficult time accessing housing and resources related to housing as a result of historic or ongoing factors in the law. Next slide. So to start, we looked at this. We looked at all eviction filings across the state initially. Due to some computing requirement issues, we have narrowed it for this analysis just down to Hartford. Hartford, we made this choice because it is one of the most active housing dockets in the state. It's a city with a lot of renters. It's also a city with a lot of disparity and between the different neighborhoods. Using the neighborhood analysis, we were able to use Data Haven's community well-being survey and neighborhood shapefiles that we have to geocode them, the evictions to each neighborhood. In the future, we'll be able to assess the evictions alongside demographic information within those neighborhoods. But as Andrew will get into in just a second, the sample size was a little bit small to do that at this point. And Andrew, I will pass it off to you to talk about the next slide.
Great. Thanks, Carter. So in order to answer some of the questions that Carter laid out there, how do no-fault evictions intersect with other dimensions that we may care about? We have to know where no-fault evictions are occurring. So that's really the goal of this analysis, this ongoing analysis that we're working on, is to really create data that to this point we haven't had, right? So I'll talk briefly just about like what data sources are available to those interested in researching evictions. First off, you have in Connecticut, the CT Judicial Branch database of eviction court filings. So this is a publicly visible database that is available online. The eviction data are stored in PDF format. So you have PDFs of notices to quit and complaints. They're organized by docket, and you can search by like town and other things to locate individual filings. So the goal here is to take this and aggregate it to different neighborhoods to see counts of evictions by neighborhood and also counts of different types of evictions, right? In this case, no-fault evictions. We actually have another data source that we can use to validate the data that we've collected from the CT Judicial Branch database, and that's Eviction Lab data, which is the Eviction Lab collects data from all over the country through a lot of databases like the one we have for Connecticut, and it compiles it and provides counts of filings for states, really down to the census tract level. So that's a great tool for validation. But importantly, Eviction Lab does not break these down by reason, right? So we really don't have ways of tracking counts of no-fault evictions in different parts of Connecticut to see, which communities are most impacted by these evictions. So the analysis that we did can be broken down you see in this slide, kind of broken down into three parts. There's the process of collecting this data from the database. That's a bulk download that's done every day to make sure that the data is current. And then the second part is processing. This is the computationally expensive part that Carter alluded to in the last slide. So we have all of these PDFs of complaints and notices to quit, but in order to analyze them, we need to convert all of that stuff into text. So the tool that we used for this is an open source library of OCR tools that's called Dockling, and it uses AI to convert PDF files to text files. So we did this for thousands of PDFs that we're collecting from the database. And this is something that's computationally expensive on my computer. As computers get better, I think they're getting better, especially at like things that require GPUs. So any sort of like AI processing. So, we can expect that this will get less computationally expensive as technology improves. Now, the third part of this research is really the analysis. Once we have this data in text format, we need to find a way to assign eviction reasons to the filings, right? And so I kind of thought of different approaches to solve this problem, working with these text files. One option would have been to send them to like ChatGPT, but the problem with that is that this data does contain PII, so you've got people's names, you've got addresses. Even though the data is stored in a public database, it's kind of data that you don't necessarily want it to be available to the wrong actors. So one really does need to be mindful about what to do with this data. So that rules out sort of any sort of analysis that requires sending this data to, say, like Anthropic via an API. I had considered some like non-large language model AI tools for classifying the evictions. So Hugging Face, which is kind of like a website where people share AI models, has a lot of models that are much smaller that can be stored locally on your computer. If you have enough RAM on your computer, you can run these, and they do some of the same things. They're AI models. Some of them kind of work the same way GPT does. So specifically for classification, the models that I'd considered were BERT models, which BERT is a type of an embedding model that really predates GPT. There's millions of variants of BERT online. So I'm still experimenting with those. The results aren't quite as good as the results you'd probably get using something like ChatGPT, just because it's a much smaller model. There are some studies that show that if you fine tune these smaller classification models, you can actually get better results than large language models. So that's one road that we might go down. But the best solution that we found for this problem is regular expression syntax, so regex for classification. So that's simply applying rules to the text and classifying based on those rules. So like if a sentence has both non and payment in it, and those two words are separated by no more than one character, then classify it a non-payment. So I came up with hundreds of different rules and assigned eviction reasons based on those rules. One of the advantages of regular expression syntax over AI is that whereas AI is a black box, with regex, you know exactly why something is classified as a non-payment, or as a writer privilege was terminated, or as a lapse of time, or as a material non-compliance. So you can actually see what rules led to different classifications. If there's some false positives in your data, you can tweak the rules and see if the false positives are fixed. So it's more transparent than AI. The downside is it's very hard to get to 100% accuracy. Usually the way, you can tweak a rule fix a certain data point, but then fixing it often sort of leads to false positives for other data. And so it's just sort of an iterative process of finding a set of rules that leads to the right set of categories for the different filings. And then finally, all of these filings we have metadata for. So the database includes property address for every filing. So we were able to just take those property addresses and run them through OpenStreetMap to geocode them. So that's how we aggregated these filings up to the neighborhood levels. Once you have latitude, longitude, figure out what census tract it's in, and we have a crosswalk, a track to Hartford neighborhood crosswalk to get neighborhoods based on every filing. Carter, you can take.
Perfect. So once we had all of the information converted, we needed to figure out how to categorize them into different causes of action. So Darren went a little bit over that at the beginning from a legal standpoint, and this is sort of how we have it set up on the back end from the quantitative data. So the first two are what we are considering the no-fault evictions. There's lapse of time, which means that the contract or lease period has ended and the landlord is continuing to not renew that. Or right of privilege terminated, which is that somebody used to have the right to reside there, but no longer has the right. So a combination of either of these or these together, if they were in the filing, was considered no fault. The last three, for lack of a better term, were considered potentially at fault, as we, I don't know if we've explained it yet, but all of these are sort of like assertions made in court and haven't been adjudicated upon. So um, it's not necessarily true. It could be that, the person is up to date on rent and it's just sort of in the court document and there was an error somewhere along the way. Um, but these three are never had a right or privilege, which is usually a squatter or if somebody is not on the lease. Material line noncompliance, which is a breach of contract of the lease, or nuisance, and this could be something like harassing of neighbors or illegal conduct on the property. And Darren, let me know if I'm misrepresenting anything from the legal side of things. And then non-payment, which is by far the most common, and that is when somebody's behind on rent. So we reviewed all of these documents. Another note, and we'll get to this in just a second, is the documents are sort of filed in a variety of ways. So sometimes, as Darren mentioned, there's this sort of like court form document that people can submit, and that can come either handwritten or typed in. And then there's also, it can just be like a letterhead with typed information, which in terms of like the legal analysis doesn't really mean much, but in terms of trying to categorize the PDFs, we had to spend a bit of time kind of tweaking those and working with that. Next slide. Awesome. So as I said, evictions were considered no fault if the court filing mentioned lapse of time and or right or privilege terminated. If it contained either of those or both of those and anything else, it was considered, for lack of a better term, at fault. Just want to emphasize that as of the time of filing, these are unproven. So as a result, our count is likely an underestimate of no fault evictions. For example, if someone had something that was filed as a breach of contract and lapse of time, but it turned out that the contract allegation was false, that would also be a no fault. Also, as we'll get on in a couple slides, it really emphasizes the need to keep this information as private as possible because people haven't necessarily done anything wrong at that point. Let's go to the next slide. And this is just an example of sort of how the numbers worked out in terms of our process. So we started collecting this data, I believe back in February. Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong. It was expanded to the whole state a little bit later in the spring, and then we sort of worked out all the bugs by June. So for the time that we were collecting the information, there were 1,438 total evictions in Hartford. For the months that we had it fully operational, so July to October, there was 813 total evictions. 800 of those were successfully converted to text and able to be geocoded. And 65 of those were no fault through the regex process that Andrew talked about. Also important to note that there are sometimes errors in the court documents. So there was at least one document that we saw that listed the town as Hartford, but the address was actually in Bridgeport. And so it ended up in the Hartford database. I don't think it was able to be successfully geocoded because it was a Bridgeport address. But things like that are sort of out of our control and lead to some of the drop off that you see. Next slide. So this is just sort of a note, and this is more of an ongoing conversation. Would love to have this conversation with anyone after the fact, but Data Haven as an organization really values transparent data and accessible data for folks. We sort of believe that communities are able to achieve better well-being and equity through access to data that they can use to improve their communities. So we had a lot of conversations about how that is sort of in tension with the privacy concerns that we have with the PII. And again, would love to have more of a conversation, but so at this point, we don't have anything publicly made available, but we are always striving to make things as accessible and transparent as possible without jeopardizing anyone's privacy. Similarly, as Andrew talked about with some of the AI models, there are risks to people's privacy in using those. So we talked a lot about, what is the most secure way to do this? What is sort of the least resource intensive way in terms of the costs of using some of the larger AI? I'm seeing a chat. Correct. So it is just the city of Hartford, Angela Harris, not the entire Hartford court. Yeah. And so next slide, I'll hand it over to Andrew for a second.
Great. Yeah, so before going over the results, just to kind of recap some of the challenges that we encountered. We've already talked about these documents. There can be inaccuracies just in how the data is stored on the core database because a lot of it is entered manually. So it's not uncommon to see, inconsistencies between like what's in the PDFs and what's stored on the information like property address that's stored on the database. You also see inconsistencies in evictions, like eviction types that are expressed in documents. So sometimes, documents will have descriptions of reasons for eviction that don't match with the kind of the section, the reason label. So they might give a reason and the description doesn't really follow logically from it. Or sometimes just like the content of these documents are unclear, right? It's making categorization difficult. Again, these are filings. They're not, so we don't have we're not using data on rulings for these, or just on the filings. There can be error in the conversion stage, especially for handwritten PDFs. Docling does much better job with typed out PDFs. This is a area that I think is improving pretty quickly, and there already are better models than the ones we use that are more computationally expensive that do better with handwritten data. But we did find, cases where, especially, and this is an issue that intersects with the regex method we use as well, where like the word non-payment, if it's handwritten, is converted into text, but one of the characters is wrong, and so the regular expression syntax may not capture it. There are ways to get around that issue, some of which we've successfully gotten around it with additional regex rules, but that's a challenge. Computing power, I think we've already emphasized at multiple stages of this analysis, computing power has been a constraint. And for that reason, the data we have so far is just for Hartford. We're still in the process of converting all of these PDFs for the other 168 towns in Connecticut. Next slide, please. So just to give a preview of the results so far, before I do that, I should just say, like, um, as Carter said, we just got to a point where the the data was all the bugs were worked out in our sort of data pull in around June, and bugs worked out. By that I mean, like, we validated this data against the eviction lab data to make sure the numbers match, right? And so we got to that point at around June. So we've collected the data, and the results that we're presenting here are from July to October. And these are total evictions for any reason during that 4-month period in Hartford, by neighborhood. So this is per 10,000 renters, I should say. So we see here that we have higher rates of evictions in a few of the neighborhoods in Hartford: Asylum Hill, Downtown, South Green. Um, there are neighborhoods that we don't have in this time period um, evictions for. So that's why we have these grayed out areas, or just insufficient numbers to provide here. So you can go to the next slide, please. So just breaking it down by no fault evictions. Remember from the filtering slide, we over this 4-month period we have 65. So that's really not a large number, and we can't make any sort of strong claims about, like, areas that have disproportionately high numbers of no fault evictions just based on 65 data points. But just to give you a preview, a sense of, I think we'll have a much better sense once we have more months of data. But this just shows the results for the data that we have. You see that a third of the 65 are in Berry Square and Asylum Hill. So that is, those neighborhoods do have higher rates per capita than other neighborhoods. But it's early days, so I don't want to make any strong claims, but really wanted to just include this in the presentation to give you a sense of how we're going to be using this data as we collect more of it and the estimates become more reliable. You can go to the next slide.
Awesome. Yeah. So to round it out, as we said, we don't really have any solid conclusions at this point, but we're happy to kind of build out different directions of analysis using this information that we have. Next slide. It also looks like my internet connection is unstable, so apologies if I cut in and out. But as far as what this means, and Darren, feel free to jump in as well, since you have a bit of a better analysis from the legal side of things. We would just really like to see, as we said, where this intersects with the different vectors of vulnerability. One of the areas that I've seen some research in, and I'm not sure how it lands in Connecticut, is the incidence of no-fault evictions and evictions in general in relation to redevelopment of.
Carter, I think oh, now you're back. Okay.
Okay. I'm not sure what we left off on.
I think on redevelopment, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that we would like to take a look at is areas that are being actively redeveloped. And I wanted to leave some space if Darren wants to add some more context on what this means.
Because I didn't get into that level of detail. But an interesting about Connecticut's housing market and the way it works is a lot of the protections, like fair rent commissions, only exist for current tenants. So if you're in a neighborhood that is gentrifying, the landlord wants to flip the unit or renovate the unit through new ownership or whatever reason, the current tenant, if they're still in a landlord-tenant relationship, could challenge a rent increase at the Fair Rent Commission in Hartford. But if that tenant is asked to leave through no cause or just cause, right? They're not protected, they're asked to leave, the rent for the next tenant can be whatever the landlord wants it to be. So a lot of the protections baked into our current statutory regime are based on you currently living in that unit. So it's no surprise that if someone is gentrifying, it's easier to clear the building then you're free to make the rents whatever you want them to be, rather than the complication of trying to rehouse people during it, as well as being built in and baked into the rents that currently existed when they first moved in. Um, so I just think that I would expect there to be some of that there as well. Um, but the law definitely favors clean slate, old tenant gone for setting the price of the unit.
I think next slide. Awesome. So yeah, as far as our goals for the next, we will continue looking at this and also converting the PDFs to text for the other towns in the state so that we can kind of have a more holistic or comprehensive look rather. One of the things I would really like to look at is the evictions in the context of the sort of five Connecticuts. So like wealthy towns, rural towns, suburban towns, urban towns, and then like urban periphery towns. Um, Another thing we've talked about, and this is maybe a little bit in the weeds, would be looking at the outcomes in the judicial district versus the housing sessions. Um, and then another thing that I'm personally really excited about is policy impact as the landscape changes. Since we have this baseline data now, as new laws go into effect, affecting renters, tenants, and landlords, we can sort of see before and after if there's an impact in the way that documents are filed in court, either in volume or in types of causes of action that are used. Yeah, I don't know if Andrew or Darren, if you have anything to add, and we can go to the next slide to open it up for questions. I'm also going to share our contact information in the chat so that it's easy for folks to copy and paste.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet, but I have a question for you all. Thank you so much for the kind of technical work that you had to do to get to this level of analysis and accurate analysis. So thank you so much for that and for presenting that to all of us today. What do you plan once you're able to, kind of work out any kinks or errors in your data? Where do you intend to use this data? What are your sort of hopes in terms of like the larger housing community or other spaces, the larger data community? How do you hope that this data gets used and by whom?
Yeah, I can open that up, and then if Andrew, if you want to add. So I think there's a couple ways that we would like to use it, and I do think at this point the sort of bugs on the back end are worked out. It's just more of a fact of like waiting for more data to come in. Um, so I think this will go. I don't know if anyone's familiar with our community well-being index, but we release that every couple of years, and we're currently in the process of doing the one for next year. It should come out in the spring at some point. That I think will be one place where we can add some more context to the housing sections there. We've also been working on sort of these like more narrowed down briefs, and if any partners are interested in like a specific question, we would love to work on more of them where we sort of focus on like one question with a partner that has more context like expertise. And in this case, I think something like this would be great for anyone that's doing advocacy around Just Cause, especially going into next session. Andrew, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
That sums up what I was going to say. Just like informing any policy that's geared toward like expanding population of those that are protected from no fault eviction, just by like spreading knowledge of like where these are most common and like how they're correlated with like different demographics.
Yeah, and I think also being able to do it in conjunction with our community well-being survey so that we have representative information from across the state at sort of a neighborhood level will allow us to kind of look at the broader context of where these evictions are affecting people.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm seeing just a couple notes in the chat. One from Finn at Connecticut Data Haven. No, from Finn about the Connecticut Data Collective has done extensive analysis on evictions. I know that at the partnership we use work done by all of you in helping to fuel our advocacy. So these resources are so important in knowing that they're out there for people to review, and also just really important that all of you were able to share this and kind of get together and do this work collectively. I think that's something that's so important. We heard about in our keynote today around sort of changing the narrative of how we talk about these things, and data, and hopefully illustrating data in different ways will help to tell those different stories for each of those communities, as we imagine those results will be really different. We've got some thank yous for doing the study, and it looks like the Can of New Haven works with a lot of clients who receive eviction and work for eviction prevention. How can we collaborate on providing information to direct staff? Great question. I don't know if any of you have a thought around sort of partnerships, collaboration around supporting staff who are doing eviction protection work.
Yeah, I think I dropped in our sort of like main email there, and we're happy to work with anyone to make sure that this information is useful and accessible to everyone that could benefit from it.
Yeah, and that's a great way for staff to have an advocacy tool in their pocket, right? Is to know the facts behind the issues that they're working on. And like I mentioned before, I think checking out both the Connecticut Data Evictions Report and Data Haven's the well-being study. It talks about all sorts of those intersections with housing and how people are affected. So kind of getting familiar with the picture of things can be really helpful in advocacy. Oh, great. And Mark is sharing some links there from the well-being survey. So I think being aware of the evidence and as things exist, and as a reminder, just to sort of bring that value-based human story to advocacy, that we learned about this morning. I was really moved by the keynote, and involving people that are have lived experience with either eviction or housing instability, I think can be really critical in doing the advocacy work here. Any other questions from folks? I just want to thank each of you, Carter, Darren, and Andrew, so much for your time and putting together, a lot, like I said, a lot of technical work being done to put this together and to present to us today. So thank you so much for being here, for presenting, and I hope all of you as participants come back and join us at another session for the conference. Thanks again, everybody.